ladies and gentlemen. We are here at the Faithless Forum, and I've got Erika from Gutsick Gibbon. Is it a YouTube channel?
It is a YouTube channel. Yes,
awesome.
Precisely.
So Erika, as I see with your shirt, if I may tilt down here.
Here it is.
So you are, what is your background? Just so people understand, when we talk about evolution, you know, is it really a fact? What's going on here? How do you know what you're talking about?
Well, my background, I think I'm apt to at least attempt to answer this question in the time span that we've got. My background is I got a BSA in pre-professional animal science. I was planning on being a veterinarian, so I had to take a ton of chemistry and a ton of physics and a ton of biology. And then I worked as a veterinary assistant, and I was like, uh-oh, I don't like this. So I decided that I was going to go get my master's degree over in London in primate biology, behavior, and conservation. So I passed my thesis this past summer. COVID, of course, threw a monkey wrench into it. But I did end up passing my thesis, so I am officially a primatologist. And I just say officially because my thesis isn't yet published, but it is in the works. So, and I'm currently a student in biological anthropology, which is to say human evolution. And I'm hopefully going to continue on and get my PhD in that, but I am just starting off in PhD program. So BSA check, master's check, PhD in progress.
Awesome.
But yeah, a lot of human evolution focus. But that being said, you can't go that in depth until you have the proper foundation. So that is to say, you got to understand what evolution is and why we know that it isn't just true, it is ubiquitous and persistent in every single branch of science that it can be examined under.
So we're starting to answer the question, right?
Yeah.
The question is, how do we know it's true? And you might need to address what it is.
Of course.
Because someone might say ignorantly, and well, if we came from monkeys, okay, how come monkeys are still around? And it happens.
It does.
What is evolution? Explain that if you can in 12 minutes. And if you don't get it right, you're going to hell. No, I'm just kidding.
No, it's okay. Listen, I'm ready. Bring it on. This is a great question to ask. So evolution tends to be misconstrued constantly. Like you said, not everybody knows what it is. And even the shirt that I'm wearing is technically incorrect in that we're seeing the single anagenetic or like linear replacement of species, where you've got this chimp-like thing that's turning into this random hominin that's turning into Homo erectus that's turning into a person. And that's great, but it's just a lot more complicated than that. Evolution, very simply, is a change in allelic frequency in populations over time, right? Critters naturally have genetics that are subject to mutation. These mutations are the raw material for evolution, right? This is what evolution can tinker with. Evolution, of course, encompassing that general definition, but also the four primary mechanisms, which is genetic drift, gene flow, mutation, and natural selection. You don't need to know the details of that. You just need to know that everything has mutations. Our regular cells have mutations all the time, and when they run awry, you end up with cancer, right? But that being said, sometimes mutations occur in the gametes, in the sex cells, and they can be passed on, and they influence an organism in a positive way. This is context specific. That's incredibly important. People don't tend to understand that what is good for an organism in one context might not necessarily be good for an organism in another context. There is no perfect fitness or form, right? And fitness just refers to, as like Darwin's classic survival of the fittest, it just refers to how many offspring can an organism produce. So you end up with this very simple formula. Organisms naturally have mutations. These mutations may be beneficial or detrimental or neutral in an environment. If they're beneficial, they'll have more offspring, and they might pass that mutation on. And then that mutation, if it truly is beneficial, will proliferate in the population. You'll see a change in that population over time. It's that simple, right? And when you explain this to people, they tend to be like, okay, I'm with you on that, right? I understand that, but that's just microevolution. That's not really evolution. It is, right? These mutation accumulations end up in speciation, which is by its very definition, macroevolution. These definitions are long-standing, and you can't just change them because you feel like it. So the question then is, okay, well, what's the evidence for this, right? Well, the easiest way to provide evidence for this, of course, is just the fact that it happens every day. It happens in natural populations, right? We currently have this ring species of salamanders proliferating out in California. And when I say ring species, I mean they have these territories that overlap. And species that are directly adjacent can interbreed, but species that are one species away from one another can't. They are experiencing a speciation event as they are reproductively isolated. They're evolving in real time. This is happening with elephants, where elephants are less frequently being born with tusks because the tusked ones get culled by poachers. So it's actually beneficial to their fitness to be born without tusks, which seems almost counterintuitive, right? Because the tusks help you defend your young from predators. But in this case, it's beneficial because you're not being predated on by humans and you survive to reproduce another day. So, of course, we see this in real time. We see it in our pathogens, right? We see it in bacteria as they adapt to our medications. And they manage to overrun us in some cases. This is the bad way of evolution, at least for us. It's great for the bacteria. And of course, we see it in the lab. We see it in Lenski's experiments with basic E. coli, things like that. And we can then take those observations, right? Evolution occurs today. We see it in real time. And we can say, well, if it occurred today, it probably occurred in the past, right? And there are two primary lines of evidence for that. Genetics, so we use our molecular clocks and we use mutation rates to take it back in time and see when these certain traits evolved and come up with genetic pathways for how they might have evolved. In the case of human evolution, my favorite example is this mutation, a partial duplication of a gene called RGAP11B. Now, the main one, all primates have it. It's called RGAP11A. And humans and Neanderthals, because we have their genome, we have this partial duplication of it. And they don't. Other primates don't. So the question is, okay, well, what does this thing do? Well, geneticists worked it out that this gene actually causes an increase in brain size. So what they did to really test this is they took RGAP11B, the human gene, and they stuck it in a marmoset, which is a type of New World monkey. And its brain increased threefold. Threefold. And it had gyri and sulci, the little swirls that, these animals are naturally very smooth-brained. Humans have very lumpy, wrinkly brains. And it got the wrinkles that we have, right? So small changes in the genome can end in these enormous morphologic changes that can benefit an organism in profound ways, right? And we can look at this in genetics and see how they impact critters and take these changes back in time to see these plausible genetic pathways. So, of course, this allows us to make predictions, right? We can say, okay, well, through these genetic pathways, we should see these specific changes evolving in the fossil record at this time, right? And we see this in spades. The classic example that's always presented is Neil Shubin, he does paleogenetics, but he also does a lot of work with paleontology, like writ large. And he was the guy who found Tiktaalik, the famous, fishapod fossil, right? And the way that he found this is he was like, okay, so we've got these eusthenopteran fish, right? They're little lobe-finned fish. And we've got these critters that are tetrapods. They're like lizard, amphibian-looking things living in the Carboniferous. So he's like, there's got to be something to bridge this gap. He's like, if there's a critter that bridges that gap, it probably has a morphology that is somewhere in between. It's a transitional, right? So like a tetrapod, maybe it has powerful pectoral muscles to push itself up out of the water. And maybe it has the beginnings of some digits so that it can kind of waddle, right? And shoulder blades that allow it to move efficiently under the pressures of gravity. But because it's still a fish, right? It still has these fish adaptations, these sarcopterygian adaptations. It probably still has the ability to breathe water, to pull oxygen from water. And it probably doesn't have as developed hind limbs as forelimbs. He was like, if this is true, it would probably be during the Devonian, right? Because we've got these eusthenopteran sarcopterygian fish that are lobe-finned and really primitive looking, living in the early Devonian and a little bit earlier. And then we've got in the Carboniferous, which is right after the Devonian, tetrapods. So he says, okay, let me see. Where was land at when this happened, right? So he backtracks the continental movement, the movement of the continents, as we know they move today because we observe them moving today. And he goes back in time, he says, all right, it's probably in Greenland. Let's go see if it's there. And it took them 3 tries, but they found it.
Wow.
And it was directly what Neil Shubin had predicted. This is the gold standard of science, making these predictions that then come to fruition. So far, we've discussed how evolutionary theory impacts our medicine. It impacts our agriculture, right? We don't get to eat the foods that we eat without utilizing artificial selection. which is just natural selection, but human utilized effectively. So medicine, agriculture, and of course, naturally, our understanding of the natural world. But it gets even cooler than that, in my opinion, when you get into human evolution, right? Because we've got this very simple prediction. If humans evolved from some kind of ape-like forebearer, what we should see is the emergence of human-like traits in these progenitor groups appearing slowly through the geologic column, right? It shouldn't be scattered and it shouldn't be all at once. You should see these traits emerge slowly. So what are the things that separate humans from these Miocene apes that are living in the past? Okay, big brains, bipedality, walking on 2 feet, and the morphologies that go along with these. So what do we see? And what we see is 7 million years ago, the emergence of an ape called Sahelanthropus chilensis. And its hole at the base of its skull is anterior or up underneath so that the skull can sit directly on top of the vertebral column, just like a biped requires, right? After Sahelanthropus, we see Ardipithecus ramidus. Ardipithecus ramidus is this fascinating hominid. It's actually my favorite hominid. And it's got that same anterior foramen magnum. And in addition, it's starting to get arches in its feet. It has sagittally oriented iliac blades so that it can attach powerful gluteal muscles that are required for standing upright. And it's got these incredible knees that are semi-valgus in nature, which means it can partially hold its weight directly underneath its body. It's a transitional for bipedality. Its noggin is still tiny. This thing's got a chimp brain. And after this, we see the Australopithecines, classic Lucy, right?
Yeah.
These things' brain case sizes, right, we'll track brain case along with it, right? So the common ancestor, Sahelanthropus chilensis, who's the proposed common ancestor right now for humans and chimps, you really can't know this for certain, but what was the common ancestor, if it isn't Sahelanthropus chilensis, was probably pretty similar, right? This thing's got a brain case size of approximately 350 cc's, right? Cubic centimeters. Humans are at 1200, so let's keep that in the back of our mind as we move through time. Ardipithecus ramidus, partially bipedal, probably habitually so, but definitely has the adaptations for moving upright. So what it was probably doing, and we know this because, like, this is the really cool part, what it was probably doing is coming down from the trees occasionally to move about on the ground. What does the climate look like in the area where Ardipithecus lived when it lived 4.4 million years ago? It's mosaic forest. It couldn't have been living in the rainforest because it's not found there. It had to move down from the trees to move from spot to spot, and the morphologic change tracks with that. So 4.4 million years ago, we're seeing already this change through geologic time from Sahelanthropus to Ardipithecus, and of course we've got other hominins in there that we're skipping, but we're doing a general overview. Australopithecus is next. This thing is living, approximately 2 to 3 million years ago. The times, because there's so many different kinds of species, are different. But just understand that it's coming after Ardipithecus, and it's coming in this range of 2 to 3 million years, right? Australopithecus has a foot that is almost indistinguishable from a human foot, right? Almost is your important word there. Its foot is not quite as efficient as ours is, rather, at transferring its weight. So when we found the Laetoli footprints, which are these famous footprints proposed to be made by an Australopithecine, they were like, let's look at the biomechanics. So they took casts of them, they took a cast of a chimpanzee, and a cast of a hunter-gatherer, and they compared the biomechanics of these three. Australopithecus is smack dab in the middle, but more human-like than it is like a chimp. So this thing is definitely derived. Its pelvis is indistinguishable from a human pelvis to the untrained eye. It's bowl-shaped, just like ours is. It has valgus knees, just like ours. All of the adaptations for bipedality, this thing is definitely moving on 2 feet. Its brain case size is 500 cc's. This thing's a pinhead, right? And this is really interesting because early in anthropology, the question was, what came first? So what separates humans? Bipedality, big brains. What came first? And everyone in the community before these hominins were found was like, well, it's our intelligence. We're so smart. It has to be, right? That's what defines us. No. What drove human evolution initially was this standing upright, this bipedality, this moving on 2 feet, which allowed us to free up the hands, interestingly enough. So, okay, cool. So now we've got these pin-headed bipedal apes moving around on the savannah. What comes next? Interestingly enough, when Homo habilis shows up, which is the first oldest member of our genus, it isn't the one that technically fully bridges the gap between Australopithecines and genus Homo. You also have Australopithecus sediva. Now, if you'll remember, Lucy's species, Australopithecus afarensis, has a brain case size of 500. Australopithecus sediba starts moving upwards in the 500 range, and Homo habilis manages to hover around 500 to 600. So you're seeing the bridging of the brain case size between these more primitive organisms and the more derived ones. So why do we say Homo habilis is a member of our genus? Why isn't it within Australopithecus if it's not that much more impressive? Because we can positively associate it with tools. This thing lived in an area, and we find its bones with faunal remains, with long bones of these ancient, long dead, ungulates, like ancient antelopes and things like that, and they have cut marks in them. And we find stone tools in the same section. They're real primitive stone tools, but they're stone tools nonetheless. And we know chimps use tools today, so it's not that hard to make them. Cool. So now we have stone tools, a biped, and it's still kind of an idiot, but that's okay because we're working our way up, right? So what comes next, right? Well, the brain case has to continue to increase, and these things still kind of have these muzzles, right? They're prognathic, that's what we call it. And so you see through the following species of Homo rudolfensis, Homo erectus, which is sometimes separated into 3 species of Homo georgicus, Homo ergaster, and Homo erectus. The brain case size exploding. It's absolutely exploding. In like 500,000 years, maybe 800,000 years, right? You're looking at an increase from 600 to 700-ish in Homo rudolfensis to like 900 in Homo erectus. Wow. We're at 1,200. We're close, right? We're getting there. So who's next? Next, we see these groups of hominins called Homo heidelbergensis. What's their brain case size? It's about 1,000, which is starting to get into the human range. So we've officially bridged the gap between all of these hominids. We're there. We have bipedal, intelligent critters that are walking around and using tools, and they explode out of Africa. They go everywhere. And as they do, they continue to evolve. Homo heidelbergensis goes up north to Europe, and then we see the emergence of Neanderthals there. Homo neanderthalensis, right? Brain case size has just absolutely, again, exploded, right? This thing's got 1,500 to 1,700 brain case size, bigger than us. But
does that mean they were smarter?
No. Okay. It was in their occipital lobe in the back. So they would have killed us in any Olympic sport that you can think of. But they weren't very clever.
Got it.
We have these big honking frontal lobes that we use to tinker and critically think. And there are some anthropologists, particularly Pat Shipman, who proposes that it was the human alliance with dogs that allowed us to outcompete Neanderthals about 40,000 years ago, which is incredible. Because what we look at in the fossil record is we see the migration of Homo sapiens when they eventually evolve in Africa and move north. They start to replace the Neanderthals, and we find wolf-dog hybrids with them, which is fascinating.
Yeah.
But Homo heidelbergensis wasn't finished. Before Homo sapiens ever left Africa, it managed to make its way out east into Asia, and we see the evolution of Denisovans, or sometimes called Denisovans. The recent drama on Paleo Twitter about the Harbin skull, which has been called Dragon Man or Homo longi, it's probably Denisovans, which means it's the best Denisovans material we have so far. That's awesome. But these aren't even the only 3 living at the same time, because we have Homo naledi living in South Africa, probably a remnant of these early Homo habilis, Homo rudolfensis types. This thing's also got a pinhead, right? It is a dumb critter, and it's got ape-like shoulders, but from the waist down, it looks like a human, right? So these guys were just isolated and living on their own down in South Africa, separated and from all of the different pressures of competition. They didn't have to evolve to be intelligent. They were already the masters of their own environments. Homo habilis, remember our handyman from earlier, probably left Africa even before Homo heidelbergensis did and made its way over, God knows how, to the island of Flores in Indonesia, where we find the remains of Homo floresiensis, a 3-foot-tall hominin, 3 feet tall, a real hobbit, right, from Tolkien's Middle Earth, which is why this idea is called the Middle Earth model, effectively. Wow. And that's where Homo floresiensis lived. And it fought, this is actually insane, it sounds like fiction, but it fought gigantic Komodo dragon relatives there, and it hunted stegodons, which are pygmy elephants. That's insane. And to this day, Indonesian people who live on Flores have a part of their mythos, a creature called the Ibu Gogo, which is described as a small monkey man who can speak in a chittery, stunted voice and steals babies. Is it a cultural memory of overlapping with Homo floresiensis? We don't know, but it sure is cool to think about. So we've got all these hominins living contemporaneously with one another, just as evolution would have predicted. Slow morphologic change over geologic time, the emergence of these incredible animals that are just like us in so many ways, but unique in all their own ways as well, and taking on these environmental challenges in novel fashions, which allowed those novel fashions to be capitalized on so that evolution, again, as we mentioned earlier, selects for what increases the fitness. And then they proliferate. So this is just a beautiful example of evolutionary theory in action. It's changes in allelic frequencies and populations over time, and it occurs over geologic periods that can be mapped. If evolution weren't valid, we should not see this slow change over geologic time, right?
Or predictions and such.
Or predictions being validated. We shouldn't see it freaking happening today if it's not legitimate. And yet here we are, the result of this incredible process that's random, but at the same time, it's got this unique ability to capitalize on what's best, quote unquote, as far as fitness goes for the organism. And that's why we're here having this conversation. And so, you know, when you get right down to it, evolutionary theory is ultimately a triumph in every aspect. And it's unique when compared to pretty much every other theory out there. There are a couple that can contend with it, but people have been going toe-to-toe with evolutionary theory for decades and decades and decades, and they can't make a dent in it because it's too applicable to every aspect of our lives that interacts with the natural world. And that's awesome. So to me, this ability to create these applicable and incredible, frankly, predictions that come to fruition, I've just listed a few examples here, is what makes a theory robust. And frankly, it puts evolution over many of the other theories that we have today. It's up there with germ theory, for example, atomic theory, right? It is the foundation of the field with which it dwells in, right? And wow. I think that's all I got.
Wow. Thank you so much. I mean, we could go on, and I could tell if I open up the can of worms.
Don't do it.
I know. But we will be having this happen in the future. Thank you so much. Everybody, obviously, go subscribe to her YouTube channel.
It was my pleasure. I've been wax poetic about this for hours and hours and hours. You really have to be careful when you ask me these questions. And I warned you.
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.